Commander has a problem. Well, it has many problems, but today we're talking about the control-shaped one. In a casual Magic format like this, it's very easy to find ourselves in games and playgroups that are completely out of control over and over again. This lack of control can be felt in many ways, but most of the time it results in 4 players racing to assemble the greediest value engine that they can and then smashing them together with the last one standing determined as the winner. Or, no one assembles their engines properly at all, and everyone limps towards a finish in a game that takes 2 to 3 hours and feels more like work than the work we're trying to escape by playing this game in the first place. In both cases, the humble but often hated and misunderstood control deck is a great answer to these situations. So this video is all about the role of control in Commander, why your next deck should probably be a control deck, and most importantly, how to play control in Commander without losing all of your friends. I recently made a video talking about how midrange is taking over Commander, and if you haven't seen that video, I'd greatly suggest going to do so because there is a bunch of important context in that video that I'm only going to touch on very briefly here. Part of that context is how, for a variety of reasons, Commander pods these days are more often than not a battle of midrange decks. A matchup of scissors versus scissors that can result in a bunch of unintentional and often undesirable effects and quite a few problems. From games just kind of feeling the same over and over again, to many players being overly precious or upset when someone inevitably pulls out a removal spell and targets an important block in our mid-range Jenga pile that sees it all come crumbling down. Not to mention grindy games where you're 2 hours in, almost no one's having fun, and someone just played the 5th symmetrical board wipe of the game. I could go on, but I'm sure for most of us that play a bunch of lower powered or bracket 2 and 3 games, this will likely resonate enough that we wouldn't mind some solutions. When I made my mid-range video, one of the main points was to explore the other archetypes that exist more prominently in 60-card formats, because the general archetypes of mid-range, aggro, and control balance each other out in the same way that rock, paper, and scissors do in that game. I've already made the case for aggro in my last video, so let's talk about what control has to offer when it comes to keeping this balance in check. A control strategy excels at providing disruption and friction to a game of Magic. Friction is a very important word which we'll come back to, and this friction ensures that opposing decks cannot be too greedy in their game plan. A control deck is effectively the sheriff of your Commander pod or playgroup. In the same way that a town in the Wild West without a sheriff would be an absolute lawless mess, a Commander pod devolves into chaos if there isn't at least the threat of a sheriff showing up. This mere potential presence of a control deck showing up in any game forces people to take their foot off the gas pedal a little bit and build things like protection into their game plan. As a related metaphor, I know I was certainly more likely to do my chores and clean my room as a kid if there was an imminent risk of my parents showing up at any time, and the dynamic that control brings to a Magic play environment is much the same. One's job as the sheriff is to be the long arm of the law and make sure that no one's being too much of a criminal. In 60-card formats and metas, control's role is to keep fast combo and aggro decks in check so they don't overrun and dominate the meta. Translated into Commander, that means that the control deck is able to punish players who overextend their resources too early and equally punish players who are being overly greedy. When a play environment has an abundance of greedy value engine based decks, a lack of control sees this problem grow out of control, much like the environment in nature when there are no predators. Being the lawman of a pod, a control deck often has far more political bargaining power than more aggressive or mid-range strategies, and this brings a whole different and interesting dynamic to a game of Commander. One could certainly challenge this for you and ask why a game of Commander or pod needs that, but if you've experienced the lawless environment enough, you'll know how one can definitely have too much of a good thing, and how games that are constantly decided by who assembled the broken value engine first, with little to no interaction, can get old pretty quick. This is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I believe that that game is called Yu-Gi-Oh! And that the interactionless race to the bottom is why so many people have stopped playing that game in the first place. One could also argue that mid-range decks have removal, so why do we need control decks? The problem is that mid-range decks typically only have a handful of single-target removal spells and maybe 2 or 3 board wipes. If you do the math, there are typically going to be far more problematic cards to remove than there is interaction to remove them in this hypothetical mid-range soup pod. This often results in a game of Commander leapfrog, where the 3rd or 4th person that assembles their Exodia wins simply because the few removal spells that exist that have already been used on those who flew too close to the sun too early. A control deck in the mix, focused around having more removal and more card draw, typically balances out this problem. Control ultimately creates friction in a game of Commander, and this friction creates and causes people to make decisions. It's these decisions where the most interesting parts of a game of Magic or Commander exist. I've spoken before about how the creation and release of tension is critical to a game of Commander. Were it not for these decisions and friction, tension wouldn't exist, and we could all just goldfish our decks at home and not bother leaving the house. So I clearly think that a control deck is worth having in one's arsenal. But other than getting to wear a sheriff's badge, why should you specifically build or play a control deck? The first reason is personal preference. Almost all of us will gravitate towards certain kinds of decks, builds, or experiences in a game. And these often have ties to our underlying personality traits. In a role-playing game, I will almost always gravitate towards stealthy, ranged characters with high survivability. And in card games, I will almost certainly gravitate towards controlling or mid-range style decks because I enjoy that dynamic and I prefer the idea of being in control of the game far more than I like the idea of running out of steam as an aggro deck. Even if it means that I don't get those quick wins and lose a bit of bite in my deck in the process. I also just love drawing cards, and controlling style decks are usually pretty good at that. You might be different. You may love the more aggressive strategies that something like a red burn deck can give you because you like putting pressure on the game, and perhaps you prefer the easier and more linear decision making doesn't leave you feeling like you've run a mental marathon each game. Either way, you likely have a preference even if you aren't aware of it yet. And if that preference, like mine, leads towards controlling strategies, then there's a good reason to make a control deck work for you in Commander. Because you're going to enjoy it more than the other styles, and why are we playing this game if not to have fun? Another great reason to pick up a control deck is that they are more resilient and versatile. If you're playing in an environment where you're not sure what you're playing into, a deck with a reasonable amount of interaction and removal will allow you to have a more balanced experience. It will also allow you to, as the name suggests, control the game a little bit more and stop any cheeky, outlandish behavior. Perhaps someone's trying to play a horrendous stacks piece that the table won't be able to deal with, or perhaps someone's deck is far more powerful than they let on. Your interaction and removal will allow you to keep the game far more balanced. This is especially helpful when playing in new environments like an LGS or a convention. Many of us have had hit or miss experiences with bad apples in these environments, but simply being able to say no to their shenanigans by using cardboard rather than social skills is a very useful tool to have at your disposal. Speaking of tools at your disposal, what better tool to have by your side than a small internet frog that tells you how to be better at the game of Magic? A frog that'll help you build better decks, play better, and have more fun. If you want more of that, like the video to tell the algorithm that you think it's good, and while you're down there, swipe right on the comments and hype up the video so that we can grow the frog army. And if you're not already, subscribe to make sure that my next banger gets delivered directly into your eyeballs. Okay, so despite my opinion that control is good, there are some pitfalls to avoid. Pitfalls that give control its bad reputation in Commander. A reputation that is often deserved because control often stops others from doing what they want and can draw out a game far longer than is necessary or good. Control is for this reason often seen as the fun police rather than the necessary sheriff. Bad control players misjudge what they should interact with or try to stop everything. They burn through their interaction, often kicking another player while they're down in the process, only to kingmake someone else who then goes on to take control of the game. This situation can create frustration and resentment by the townsfolk because they see the sheriff, who has all the guns, as incompetent. So you definitely want to be a responsible pilot when you're picking up a control deck, but we'll come back to that in just a little bit. What's worse than an incompetent sheriff is a competent but corrupt one. I think that far too often the occasional bad apples that we encounter are seeking a power trip, and that the fastest way to get there is to track people in a game that they, the bad apple, are in complete control of. But these bad apples are going to ruin our fun regardless, whether they're playing a control deck or not, and you are almost certainly not a bad apple. What's far more likely is that you're going to end up interacting with people's stuff and making them sad. There's a reasonable amount of people playing Commander that intentionally or unintentionally want to feel like a special boy or girl and show off their deck. Then when anything stops this from happening, it creates a situation where they have a bad time. Control is obviously enemy number one to those people in those situations, and if you have that happening in your playgroup, playing a control deck will see you draw their ire. Now, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I've fallen into this trap many times, as I think that most of us have, but I would argue that the fault here lies not with the control player, and that if one cares more about showing off your deck than you do playing an engaging game of Magic, then one may as well have everyone do a PowerPoint presentation of the cool things your decks are capable of before the game, get that out of the way, and then everyone can sit down to play an actual game of Magic. I say that mostly tongue-in-cheek, but I'm mainly just trying to highlight that bad vibes towards people that stop others from, in air quotes, playing the game is often misguided, and if you dig into it, probably a little bit selfish. Lastly, and probably most likely, is that one accidentally builds a bad control deck or pilots a control deck badly. An objectively bad control deck is one that draws the game out and that wins far too slowly if it wins at all. This is probably the number one trap to avoid. So let's talk about that and how you can play Control in a way that doesn't cause your friends to kick you out of your playgroup. I think the first thing to understand here is that playing Control in Commander is not about stopping people from playing the game entirely. It is more about shaping the game at key moments. Things like punishing sloppy sequencing, keeping greedy or explosive decks honest, and creating a game where timing, restraint, and threat assessment really matter. You only really want to be stopping things that'll end the game or things that will critically impact your specific game plan. If there's a big problem and it's not going to affect you personally, then you don't have to deal with it. If you do choose to deal with it, you can use that as a politicking tool to get value back from the people that it will have affected. I say this because you don't have enough answers for everything in the game of Commander, and you need to balance your control window around your win conditions and not completely enrage your friends before you're in a spot to try to win the game. All this said, a control deck in Commander, in my opinion, exists to control parts of the game it needs to control till it can execute its win condition. Remember, it's the winning of the game that's the goal, and not the controlling of the game. Control is our path to winning, and not our win condition. Therefore, our win conditions often need to be highly impactful and highly capable of winning a game very quickly, something like a combo. This ability to win the game quickly is important because a Commander control strategy is only going to be able to establish complete control of a game in small bursts. It's not an always-on kind of a thing purely because of the multiplayer nature of the game and the abundance of resources pitted against us. If and when you attempt to win the game, you want to have established short-term control and maintain that short burst of control till your win condition takes effect. But this of course means we need to have enough win conditions, or ways to find those win conditions, and this is the number one thing that most control decks get wrong. They don't have enough win cons, and the win cons that they do have are too ineffective or too slow. When I'm helping someone with their decks and they want to make their decks more powerful, I'll often focus on how quickly one's deck is able to escalate towards a win, and that is especially true with a control deck. Opinions on what good or satisfactory win conditions are is always going to be a little bit subjective. But typically for me, a good win condition in a control deck should be able to end the game the turn that you play it, or at least the following turn. And ideally, it needs to be a proactive play that wins you the game rather than simply stopping everyone else from playing the game. In my experience, Commander players absolutely hate having a lack of agency, or not being able to do anything in a game. And a combo that says that your opponents can't play any spells, for example, will see them scoop, but they won't be in any way happy about it. Instead, let's take a look at some win conditions that I think are pretty good. In a deck that has a lot of life gain, something like Aetherflux Reservoir is a fantastic win condition. Approach of the Second Sun is fantastic in a deck that has lots of card draw so that it can play it on consecutive turns. Wiping the board and then playing Rise of the Dark Realms is a great win condition, especially if you've been filling your own graveyard or milling your opponents. There are plenty of other creative ways one can go about winning depending on your deck, like wiping the board and then playing Fan Daniel with a graveyard full of instants and sorceries to kill everyone in a Dimir Spellslinger deck. Or perhaps if you're an OG in the Frog army, you'll know all about blowing up a giant Orc army with a Chandra's Ignition, or Flashback Increasing Vengeance and a Soul's Fire in my Sauron deck. In my Mathis Surge Channeler or Simon Wild Magic Sorcerer deck, the goal is to stack cost reducers and then a High Tide, and take a huge turn where I'm going to draw my entire library and win with a Laboratory Maniac or a Jace. I'm going to call out that this deck includes what I would normally frame as a very toxic commander card in Forbid, which can be absolutely miserable to play against. But here it literally serves one purpose, which is protecting my win condition multiple times if necessary on the same turn. What it's definitely not doing is countering every single spell my opponents play across multiple of their turns. Another good way to build better control decks is to build a balance of proactive and reactive plays. Not simply all reactive cards and a win condition. A deck of 20 board wipes, 15 counter spells, and 15 single target removal spells will only serve to enrage the people that find themselves unlucky enough to be in your presence. Instead, you want a control deck that has plenty of things that it can do that don't specifically impact your opponents, and that give you proactive game actions to take. Having proactive game actions is probably the number one thing that you can have to make playing your deck feel really good, and it'll lessen your opponent's ire against you. Using my Sauron deck as an example, I've got plenty of proactivity built into the command zone with Sauron because every time someone plays a spell, I get closer to my win condition. I have cards like Lasertep Chancellor, Maha Uruk-hai Captain, and Saruman to support this, so my game plan isn't simply about removing things. I then have plenty of card draw spells, and spells with the ring temp mechanic on them because a big part of my game plan is to cycle through my deck and fill my graveyard so that I can use those spells to win later. In my Mathis or Simon deck, I'm proactively playing tons of card draw spells, because it both gives me more resources and gets me closer to my win condition of decking myself. In this deck, me drawing tons more cards doesn't feel oppressive to play against, even if card draw is the most broken thing in the game. As a final example, in my Galazeth Prismari deck, I have tons of proactive plays building out an enormous mana base, because any cards that I cast that create artifact tokens essentially give me mana rocks. I then use all this mana to draw lots of cards, and I end the game with highly powerful X spells that usually win in a single turn. Last but not least, I would suggest including spells that synergistically impact as many of your opponents as possible whilst not affecting you. This allows you to turn your removal into a resource advantage that you can use to create a window where you have control and attempt to win. Whilst the card like Farewell on paper fits the bill here, that's not really what I mean. I've spoken about asymmetrical or one-sided board wipes before, but really I mean any card that is dramatically shifting or trading a lot of resources. For example, a board wipe like Promise of Loyalty is great if you only have one creature out, as is a board wipe like Urza's Ruinous Blast if you're only playing Legends. Or perhaps you're running a commander like the Locust Guard, and a board wipe like Earthquake will kill all of your opponent's stuff but leaves your board untouched to try and end the game. Alternatively, a simple Fog can completely turn the tide of the game. Even more so if it's a Tangle and completely locks down that player's board for an entire turn, opening them up to counterattacks from the entire table. A spell like Moment's Peace and the threat of its flashback can completely turn the tide of a game by ending up sending creatures that would have gone at you elsewhere. Whilst these fogs are trading a resource that I would probably define as tempo, a card like Hull Breach or Collective Resistance can trade multiple cards for one. Soul Shatter is probably one of the best examples of this, and a personal favorite of mine is Aloran's Searing Light, where I get a 3-for-1 trade which often deals with the biggest, most problematic creatures on the board and potentially gets me much closer to a win, which is exactly what a control deck wants. It's for this reason that Aloran's Searing Light is often a game-winning finisher in my Aragorn Spellslinger deck. And if you're curious about any of the decks that I've mentioned, I've linked videos to them or the deck lists down in the description. The list of possible card inclusions here is incredibly long, but in short, any card that will generate a resource advantage for you, be that mana, card advantage, or something like tempo, especially if you're taking those resources from an opponent, are the core of a good control deck in Commander. It's this latter part that makes an Aikido deck one of the most fun embodiments of a control strategy in Commander as well. Just remember to pair destroying or taking your opponent's stuff with a bunch of proactive plays and good quick win conditions, and your control deck will be perfect and everyone will love you. Maybe. But most importantly, you'll bring balance to your pods and playgroups, and your friends will almost certainly appreciate the results of that. I hope that you found this useful, and I'd love to hear your takes and thoughts on Control and Commander down in the comments. If you want to support what I do, smash up the like button or head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there. If you want some personal tailored help, or you're just horribly rich and want to jettison some money, you can find that over on my Ko-fi, all of which you can find the links to down below the like button. If you've enjoyed this video and haven't watched my aggro or midrange videos, go and do that, or go and watch one of these videos, and as always, thank you for being here.